It's been a formula that worked well for me. And I I find that for both adults and young adults, if you put in too many characters, you overwhelm the reader, and pretty soon they don't care about any of the characters. But if you limit the number of characters to say maybe 8 or 9 for adults and maybe 6 or 7 for young adults, then the reader grows attached to a character and they want to turn the page to see what happens to them. And there's just so many good books out there. If I get overwhelmed with a bunch of characters in a book I'm reading in the first 2 chapters, I just put it aside and move on because I don't care what happens to them. And so in part one, I'm going to introduce you to the main characters, the ship itself that was called the Laconia, and the U-boats involved, in particular one U-boat that is the one that actually sinks this ship. So the Laconia is a British ship. It was a former passenger liner that was converted into a troop ship, about 600 feet. And in September of 1942, it had left Egypt, come through the Suez Canal, and then down around the Horn of Africa, the tip of Africa, and now it's heading north along the African coast, heading towards the United Kingdom. And it's a big ship. It's got 2,700 passengers on board, so it's like the Titanic in some respects. But an important caveat is it wasn't just British military people. There were 1,800 Italian POWs on board, guarded by 100 Polish guards. And there were also some women and children as well. The rest were the military men. So big ship with a lot of people on board.
Wow.
And here it is. I always like to take a close look at these ships that I write about. This is one of the bigger ones in any of the nautical books I've done. But one of the important things in this slide is that smokestack belching up the black smoke. That's what ends up giving it away. Even though the ship was zigzagging, knowing there could be U-boats in the area, that didn't do much good if you're sending up a big cloud of black smoke. It was on its own. There was a lack of escorts to be with it, and the Allies were preparing for Operation Torch, which was the invasion of the Morocco area of the African continent. So most of our escort ships were getting ready for that big invasion. So the Laconia was traveling alone, and one of the reasons it went out 700 miles off the coast was thinking it would not run into any U-boats. But they were zigzagging, which can be an evasive maneuver. But in another book I worked on about the USS Indianapolis, the Japanese U-boat commander in that book, when he testified later at a court martial, he said zigzagging really didn't make the ship any safer. So for the kids' book, I tried to really zero in on 4 main characters, and there were 4 or 5 others as well, but the 4 primary ones I'll introduce you to. You'll meet them through photographs. Probably the most important one in the beginning of the book is the U-boat commander who sinks the ship, Werner Hartenstein. And on board the Laconia is 31-year-old Doris Hawkins, who is a nurse. You know, it's so hard sometimes to find combat episodes in World War II that involved women. And so this was fantastic to have not only Doris be involved, but to have her leave an account of what happened to her. And she turned out to be an incredibly tough survivor. And then two 20-year-old sailors, Jim McLaughlin and Tony Large, both left full accounts of what happened. I relied very heavily on those, probably a little more so on Tony Large's. And they were all from the Great Britain, by the way. So while the Americans are going to play a little bit of a role later on the ship, there were no Americans. So here's Tony. And again, just very fortunate that these people wrote down shortly after this incident. They wrote down exactly what happened. Some of these eyewitness accounts were in the British archives. A couple were actually self-published books that have long since been forgotten. And Doris in the left there, she left an account as well. I'm going to let somebody in here. And then the U-boat that Commander Hartenstein was on was the Class 9 U-boats. They were the biggest ones. Really incredible feats of engineering. They could travel for weeks and weeks without being refueled. And if they needed to be refueled, they would meet in a secret location with another U-boat that the Germans nicknamed the Milk Cow. And the Milk Cow only carried extra fuel and extra torpedoes. And so ships, other U-boats could rendezvous with it and refuel and reload with new torpedoes. And again, these were the U-boats that attacked the United States as well. It was the Class 9 that could travel across the Atlantic and have enough fuel left to do a whole patrol. And in my book, So Close to Home, one of them goes right to the mouth of the Mississippi River. And it's like a turkey shoot. It's so easy. They're sinking ship after ship. We were woefully ill-prepared. But by September of 1942, the Allies were in a much better position, but still, it was dangerous to be at sea on any kind of ship. So I discussed this, but on usually a 6-week patrol, longer if they rendezvoused with the Milk Cow, and 55 men crammed in there, boy. I don't know how they did it. You could not have the least bit of claustrophobia to handle 6 weeks at sea, mostly submerged. You really didn't, if you were one of the working men, you really didn't get one of the chances to come up on the conning tower deck when they went on the surface at night. Because what these U-boats would have to do is travel on the surface at night using diesel fuel, and that would recharge the batteries. And then during the daytime, when they could be spotted by an enemy plane or a ship, they'd have to submerge, and then they'd switch over to the batteries. So the diesel would recharge the batteries at night. And here's Werner Hartenstein. He was one of the more experienced U-boat commanders. Incredibly, only about 5% of the various U-boat commanders survived the war. And as you get into 1943, they had a pretty good idea they were not going to come out of this war alive, yet they continued to serve. There is a Class 9 U-boat at the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry, and here's a cutout of the inside. This is U-505. A couple of the U-boats that we're going to talk about today were sister ships to this, U-506, U-507. This makes it look spacious, but it's not. Not when there's 55 people on board. I remember I went on this when I was just 22 years ago at that museum, and who would have thought that I would dive into this in such a big way in my 60s later in life. I'm going to just let in Victor here. People are coming in. So if you're ever in Chicago, it's well worth the visit to go inside. It's the only U-boat here in America that you could uh, take a tour through. And when they attacked America, they came back. This would have been the attacks on America mostly occurred in March of 1942, April, May, when they returned to occupied France, where the U-boat bases were, such as Lorient, France. That was perhaps the biggest one. They returned as heroes because they had such success. One U-boat would come back and have sunk maybe 10 major ships. And the real prize was going after the giant oil tankers because that would fuel the war for the Allies. And they had great success. So I recently rewatched the movie Das Boot and realized just how accurate that movie was. So many movies, you don't know what's true and what's not. But in this case, having studied that period, I realized, wow, they did a great job. And in the book of mine, that was turned into a movie called The Finest Hours. It stars Chris Pine and Casey Affleck. I'd say 80% of the movie is true, and that's a pretty good ratio for Hollywood. But you always wonder, if you're not familiar with the event, okay, what parts are true and what parts are not. I wish they'd put out a little summary after the movie's shown. Same thing with some of these television documentaries where they add a little more drama than what was needed. So the U-boat pens, these were the ones in Lorient, France. It was interesting to read some of Churchill's notations during the war. He said, we bombed those pens relentlessly and think we did some real damage. But then you read Admiral Karl Darnitz, the head of the U-boats and later of all the German Navy. He said they bombed the heck out of our pens, but did absolutely no damage because it was so thick with concrete and reinforced rebars inside that they got away basically unharmed. Here is Karl Darnitz. He's going to play a role in this event with the Laconia. I just completed reading his memoirs. It's a big tome of a book. Some parts are pretty slow, others are fascinating. He talks about getting to know Hitler a little bit and reporting to him. And he complains that at the beginning of the war, Hitler wouldn't listen to him, where Dönitz was saying, hey, we've got the UK on its knees with our U-boats. If you just would free up all the U-boats, we can do them in. And Hitler refused. He said, no, we're going to keep back at least 20% to protect our northern flank in the North Sea there. So I think Dönitz was right. Hitler thought he was smarter than everybody else. But Dönitz surprised me later by saying, he said one-on-one, he said Hitler could actually be very charming, which shocked me. And then at the end of the war, when Hitler killed himself, he named Dönitz as the head of Germany. And so it was Dönitz who did the unconditional surrender. At the end, Dönitz was trying to buy time. Russian army, and that's why he was reluctant to sign that unconditional surrender until Eisenhower forced his hand. So now we're going to get into the incident itself, and the Laconia is zigzagging, coming up that coast 700 miles off the coast of Africa, and Hartenstein in the daytime sees the black smoke. You can see the direction the ship is heading, and so he just lies in wait for it for nightfall to come, where he can basically put a torpedo or two into it almost point blank, maybe 500 yards away. So The attack occurs at 8 p.m. By now it is dark, and uh, the ship is in serious trouble right away. Unlike, I was reading about, studying the USS Indianapolis. On on that attack, the ship went up in flames immediately, so people were just jumping off left and right. With the Laconia, the fires were small, so it was a very different kind of abandoned ship. Some people were able to get in lifeboats. They had more lifeboats than life rafts. A lot of the life rafts they never did free. But you had a lot of issues abandoning ship because you had 1,800 Italian POWs locked in cages below, and guards weren't letting them out. They wanted the British to evacuate the ship first when they knew it was going to sink. And it's amazing what life and death struggles can do. But those prisoners had enough strength at that point to just tear the bars apart. And they were held back at gunpoint and bayonet, and shots are fired. But they want to get off this ship before it goes down. So some of them do escape and are jumping overboard. So the Laconia is sunk not too far from that Ascension Island where the U.S. does have a communication center, has an airstrip, has a Liberator aircraft, amongst others. 2 torpedoes are fired. Usually what the U-boats do is they want to conserve torpedoes, so they may fire one, and if they don't see the ship listing severely, they'll let another one go, and then they'll just watch. They want to make sure the ship goes down, because a lot of ships can take a torpedo and not sink. In this case, it took a while for the ship to go down. It took about an hour. Again, comparing it to the Indianapolis, that sank in 12 minutes. It does go down in a part of the ocean where you have a lot of barracudas and sharks. And you can imagine with 2,800 people, not all of them made it to the water, but a lot did. These sharks are well aware where they are. And so you have accounts from Doris, from Tony Large, and Jim McLaughlin, those 3 people that I follow closely. Doris said she had to jump over, and an Italian POW who couldn't swim is clutching at her and pulling her down, so she has to fight him off, and finally she does make it to one of the lifeboats. Lifeboats are crammed, by the way, standing room only. So you had some fires on this is not the Laconia, because again, that's happening at night. We don't have photos of it. But it wasn't the conflagration that you had on the Indianapolis. So if you can imagine, like, put yourself, pretend you're Hartenstein. He's on the U-boat. He's up on the conning tower. He's congratulating himself that they've sunk this big British ship, and he sees people, jumping overboard, lifeboats being lowered. The Germans had a code of conduct that they would not strafe and kill survivors, but neither would they rescue them ordinarily either. So very different than the Imperial Japanese submarines. They would kill as many as they could who were swimming in the water. So Hartenstein's up on the deck there, and he hears cries for help, but some of the cries are in Italian. And he's listening closely, and he's putting 2 and 2 together and thinking, oh no, I just sank a ship full of our allies, the Italians. I can't leave them crying for help in the water. I'm going to start rescuing them. And because it's at night, he can't distinguish an Italian from a Brit. So he decides, I just got to rescue as many as I can. So he lets Donitz know what he's doing, and he's waiting for Donitz Dönitz is, I guess how you pronounce it, to get back to him, whether cease this rescue operation or continue. And in his memoirs, Dönitz said that was a really tough call, but he could not let those allies just drown in front. So he gave Hartenstein permission to continue this rescue operation. And so Hartenstein goes on the radio and on the, I guess what you would call public airway, said, "I'm declaring this a neutral area. I'm rescuing as many as I can. Here's our position." So he's giving himself away. And then he says, "If there's any other U-boats in the area, I need your help. There's hundreds and hundreds of people in the water." And as luck would have it for me, one of the U-boats that comes to his aid, actually two, are the two that I write about in the earlier book, So Close to Home. So that's the only way I would have ever known about this incident. It's just not well known. There was only one book done about it, and that was written 40 years ago, so it's out of print, and there was a few factual errors in it. So very lucky that this had escaped a lot of attention. So he's taking the Italians and bringing them up onto the U-boat deck, and anybody who might be injured, and British women or children he's taking on board. Whereas British men, he's keeping in the lifeboats, but he's tying the lifeboats in kind of a conga line behind his U-boat to keep them all together from drifting apart, because he's put the word out that he needs help, hoping that some kind of ship will come and take all these people. So Doris is one of the lucky ones who gets taken on board the U-boat, and actually is taken down below and given some tea and some bread. Tony is in the life raft being towed behind it. This gives you an idea of just how crowded the U-boat, the lifeboats were. Here, the Hartenstein's U-boat is lifting up a small lifeboat and bringing it on board to take out the Italians and put the British men back in the water on the lifeboat and tow it. And this is the one and only picture of some of the British women and children on board the U-boat. It was taken by a German. And it was interesting, the women later said they were treated very well, given blankets and tea. And Hartenstein said one of them asked, "Are we all going to be killed?" And he goes, "No." And another one said, "You're treating us so well, I'm going to find a way to get the word of what's happened to Winston Churchill." I don't know if she ever did or not, but this whole incident was covered up by both the British and the Americans right after it happened. So nobody really knew the full details until after the war. Here you see some of the people on the U-boat itself. Some have the life jackets on. Some of these are also the U-boat sailors themselves, like that person in shorts there, I believe, in the back. So Donitz says, "Okay, you can continue." Berlin is not happy about this, nor is Hitler. But and two more U-boats come to the scene, and I'll show you the commanders of those. And he wants it to be clear what he's doing to the allies in the area, that hey, we're doing a rescue here. So he paints a big red cross on a sheet and puts it on top of his U-boat. He's on the radio now and then saying what he's doing. And the second U-boat arrives. this young commander's on board. Again, we had access to his war diary. His name is Eric Verdeman. He was the main character in the earlier book, So Close to Home. That's why we know a lot about him. So I've got all his war diaries from every single patrol that he was on, right up until his death. And the other U-boat, there's 3 in total. So Hartenstein, Verdeman, and then Harrow Schatz, you see in this picture. He was a really interesting character. If he sank a ship, for instance, and he didn't feel threatened by enemy aircraft, he'd go up to the survivors and he'd go, sorry about that. If they were Americans, he'd go, you have Roosevelt to blame for this. And then he would give them water. He might give them cigarettes. And in one case, in the Gulf of Mexico, he actually gives them a cake that he had picked up in France. And then he points which way land is if they've got oars. So they were not killing survivors, but they weren't rescuing them normally either. That's why this incident is very unusual. And then the next phase of this whole incident, it gets even stranger. So here's on Verdeman's U-boat. They're pulling one of the lifeboats up close and people are disembarking. You see one of the few couple of women there. I wonder if that's Doris or not. We'll never know for sure. But you can see the U-boat guys. He's just in a pair of shorts because it's so hot inside the U-boats. They're dressed down to their shorts. The Italian POWs were in their shorts as well because they were in the hold of the Laconia, and they were ill-clothed as well where it was hot. So when the 2 additional U-boats come, Hartenstein is so crammed with people on his U-boat, he starts transferring them. And that's what's happening in this photo. They're being transferred from Hartenstein's vessel in the rear there towards the one in the front. And doing this, they are sitting ducks for enemy aircraft, and that's why they painted those red crosses on the sheets. These are mostly the Italian POWs, and the U-boat is almost as crowded as the lifeboats were on deck. There's not enough room to go below. They've taken the injured below, and some of the women and children are below. There was one teenage girl who did leave a diary about it, and she said how exciting it all was to her, and it gets even more exciting for her coming up. Absolutely standing room only on Hartenstein's U-boat. This is dawn on day 2. The ship has long since sank. So on Ascension Island and in Africa as well, the British have picked up this radio message from Hartenstein saying, this is a neutral scene, I'm doing a rescue. And the authorities on Ascension Island decide, let's go investigate. We're going to send over a couple liberators to see what's going on. And the pilot, he sees that the U-boat is on the surface, packed with people and the Red Cross. So he radios back, okay, I've located it. It's jammed with people. What are my instructions? And the instructions don't come back immediately. So he's up there just doing, circles above this area. And then surprisingly, his instructions come back, sink sub. And the sub he's circling is Hartenstein's. And although no one ever gave a clear reason for why in terms of the Americans at that time, it had to be that if we don't sink this sub while we have the opportunity, it's just going to sink another ship. So they're prepared to have casualties, even perhaps British casualties, by doing this, apparently. So I like to call it friendly fire, but on purpose. So there's two ways of looking at it. One, they should have never done this. The U-boat's putting itself at risk, and all those survivors have just gone through hell of their ship sinking. But the other way of looking at it is this U-boat, if they let it get away, is going to do this whole scenario all over again. So sink the sub, that's all it said. And that must be the logic, is get it before it sinks more ships. And they did have uh, a German sub that lobbed shells at Ascension Island. So I'll bet that plays a part in the thinking as well. So the Hartenstein later said that the first bomb or depth charge drop was off target. And I always wondered, um, maybe that was done on purpose to warn the people in the sub, because the pilots might have felt bad about killing these innocent survivors on the sub, and because it was, easy pickings, clear day. The pilot, zoomed down right above the U-boat. So how he could have missed by a far angle, I don't know. But he comes back again. So maybe this was a warning. I don't know. We'll never know. He never said that. But the next time around, the shot is a lot closer. This is not it. But interestingly, this shot is a few months later of Eric Verdemann's U-boat being sunk. Verdemann is killed during this. He was on the conning tower. So this isn't from the Laconia incident, but it is involving one of those subs, and this time uh, in the Laconia incident, when they're bombing Hartenstein, the next bomb actually drops very close to the sub, and it makes a direct hit on one of the poor lifeboats, killing everybody in it. And Tony Large was in another lifeboat. He said the waves and from that bomb capsized his boat, and he found himself right back in the water again with all these barracudas and sharks. Jim McLaughlin had been bitten by a barracuda, so he was already injured. But Tony Large later found his way back into another lifeboat. There were 55 men, all men in his lifeboat. Doris, she was on the deck of the sub, and Hartenstein shouts, "Everybody off," except for the Italians were diving, when the first bomb was dropped. So they're sealing the hatches, and the British have to throw themselves into the ocean. And Doris finds herself on board a lifeboat with there were 62 people, and it was just her and one other woman. They were the only two women on board. So Doris slides into the sea. That next bomb hits the lifeboat. It did slightly damage Hartenstein's sub, but they were able to repair the damage. Tony, just a miracle, he survived. He was flung into the air. But those who did survive try to get into lifeboats that were not capsized. Some held on to lifeboats that were upside down. So when we get in a day later, a Vichy French ship called the Glory arrives on the scene, and they're picking up whoever is left alive, and they eventually take those British to a prison camp in Africa. But because of the currents and the wind, the lifeboat that Tony was on and the lifeboat that Doris was on has drifted far from where the Glory came, and the Glory never found those. So those poor souls are adrift 700 miles off the coast of Africa. Here's the Glory rescuing some survivors that held on to an upside down lifeboat. So part 3 of the book, it kind of morphs into a survival story, which is kind of my bread and butter as an author. I've written 7 books about survival at sea, and my latest book is called Extreme Survival: Lessons from Those Who Have Triumphed Against All Odds. And that's a compilation of the very best survival stories that I've come across. Some of the survivors I've interviewed personally, others were from history, but I wanted to focus, 1, telling their survival story, but 2, how did they do it when I was thinking there's no way I could have survived. And Tony does have a couple interesting observations that I did put in Extreme Survival. So these lifeboats were not very big. Imagine 68 people in a 30-foot boat, standing room only. But because they're going to be adrift for so long, people are dying, and there's going to be ample legroom. There's no shelter from the sun during the day, and then from the freezing nights, only a little bit of water. They run through the biscuits and chocolate in the first week. I'll leave some suspense for when you read the book about what happens to some of the survivors. There's cases of murder on board. There's cases of madness on board. You name it, it all happens in this incredible several-week survival story of these 2 lifeboats. Doris was trying to make herself useful and she had some records she was scrawling on. Who's dead? D, I guess, was for those who were dying, and who's alive. And in Tony's, of the 51 men, incredibly, only 4 survived. And I think one of the reasons Tony made it was he had been in the British military as an ordinary seaman on a different ship that had been sunk. So he's gone through this experience before, and I think that helps him in terms of your mental toughness, because he knew, he made it if you just go for as long as it takes. On his lifeboat, he explained that a young man snuck some of the group's drinking water at night and drank some. They caught him, and they warned him, you do it again and that's it. And sure enough, he does it again the next night, and they catch him, and they don't even have to say a word. He just climbs over the side of the lifeboat and swims away. That's, the punishment. So they've got their own rules on the 2 lifeboats. So the current is going to bring them to the north. Now, if the winds change a little bit and it pushes them a little more towards the west, they're going to miss landfall altogether. So it's going to be touch and go. Will they hit Africa? If they miss it, it's all over. And they've got 600-700 miles to drift. They try to erect, a sail made out of clothing. That doesn't work. They've got a couple oars, but they, lose their strength. They're not able to row. But they're trying a bunch of different things to increase their odds of survival. And my main characters make it, because how else would I know what happened on the lifeboats? But it's an amazing story of determination for Doris, for Tony, and Jim. And when they do make it, it's a long road to freedom, because you can imagine washing ashore on some isolated coast of Africa. And I won't give that part away. They're not home free. They've still got more survival stories to go. When they finally do make it to the British, they're told, uh, when you talk to anybody about the sinking of your ship, you're not to talk about the U-boat rescue or the Allied bombing. So that's why this is a lesser known incident. Tony was, I think one of the reasons he made it was, and in the new book of mine, Extreme Survival, it's a whole chapter about survivors who just take the attitude of for as long as it takes. In other words, they don't set an artificial deadline of, oh, well, maybe I can make it for 2 days. They are just going to take the attitude, I'm going to go down fighting. And one of the people in that chapter of Extreme Survival is John McCain. And because he was 7 years as a POW. And McCain had a phrase for it. He called it steady strain. In other words, you're under a strain, but don't make it worse by getting your hopes up and then you're not freed. And then because he watched men go into total despair if they got hopes up and then they were dashed. And Tony was taking the same mindset, having been a survivor before. It was just hang on, fight until I die or until I'm rescued. But I'm not going to get my hopes up if we see a plane in the distance or we see a ship. I'm just going to keep that steady strain, in John McCain's word. So if you are interested in abandoned ship about the Laconia, it is on my website for a discount, and I can personalize it. There's a place for you to tell me who you want me to write it to if you want to give it as a gift. But I'm encouraging people, us adults, read it. It's a good sized book, and then try to share it with some young one to get the younger generation into this history that's so important, so we don't repeat some of it. And my daughter put this collage together of all the books for adults. So that one I mentioned, how one leads to another. So at the bottom is so close to home there. That's the story about the first U-boat that enters the Gulf of Mexico. And that's how I learned about the Laconia. And it's very interesting how one book leads into another. You either meet somebody and they say, hey, you need to look into this, or they go, hey, I know this particular survivor. He would like to meet with you. It's really interesting how they kind of fall into place and lead to each other. And I do want to end the presentation on an upbeat note, because Doris, she was amazing. She kept her sense of humor throughout this ordeal. She kept that nursing mindset of trying to help others through it. And I just thought, wow, what a testament to a courageous soul. And she later actually met Tony, who was in a different lifeboat, many years after the war, and they were able to each discuss their experiences. Both have passed away, so I was never able to meet either one of them. We only met one survivor from the Laconia. She's well into her 90s. She was a girl at the time. But Richard, now we can open it up to any questions or comments.
Okay. Well, I'll start with a question. Do we know who the commander was that gave the order for the Liberator to sink the boat, the U-boat?
It took some time, but we do. His name escapes me right now, but we do. And in an interview, he kind of dodged around the topic, but the message came, if you have a U-boat, you've got to sink it, period. So we're following the military instructions. And whether he knew they were British on board or not, it's hard to say. Probably did, since the Laconia was a British ship. He would have assumed they were British and Italians.
It's a shame because it would have made a more amazing story if the Americans or the Allies helped, one of those interwar cooperation stories like, the First World War, the Christmas truce or things like that.
That's what that's what I was hoping for, Richard, when I came across the story. And I was like, darn, they had to
Yeah.
drop these
For
bombs.
everybody listening, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself or go onto your little microphone icon on the bottom left of your screen. If you have a question, we'll entertain a few questions. If nobody has any, then we'll end this, but feel free to ask any questions, but you have to unmute your microphone. Let me see if there's a way I can unmute them all. I can.
I found it amazing how long the human body can go without food and can go with so little water. They didn't get a rainfall until, several weeks into their survival experience. So up until then, they were taking like a tablespoon of water in the morning, another one at 10 a.m. It's incredible. The body is much tougher than we think it is, apparently. I see a couple of chats. I'm going to see if I can open that. Thank you. Yep. But if anybody has a question, you can put it in your chat or you can unmute your microphone.
I have just a fast question. We saw a very nice picture of John McCain, and
Yeah.
I forgot, how was he involved in this?
He wasn't involved in this, but I've done a new book. It's called Extreme Survival, and it's the lessons learned from the toughest survivors.
I get it.
And John McCain is one of the people I profile.
Okay.
And he's the one that kind of summed up that attitude of as long as it takes, don't put yourself in a position to get your hopes up that rescue is imminent.
Right. I see the
Tony,
yeah.
And I'm glad you asked the question because Tony Large in this incident in Laconia said a plane went by, everybody assumed rescue was coming within an hour, and when it didn't come, he said some men just started sipping seawater. They gave up. They that was the end. And lo and behold, 2 days later it rained. If they had just hung on.
Michael, did you see the chat or the question from Victor where he says,
No.
have survivors ever met any of the German submariners?
Afterwards, I am not aware that ever happened. No, because most of the German submariners perished in the war. Hartenstein died, Schatz died, and Verdeman all were sunk. In Verdeman's case, we know his last words because he was swimming in the water. He escaped the sub as it went down. 2 men were holding him up. Big waves were slapping him in the face, and Verdeman was injured. And he just said, let me go, let me go. And they let him go, and he disappeared. So it's very unusual to know exactly what happened in his final.
What was Hartenstein's fate?
He was sunk a year later. The liberators were just so effective once we figured out, radar to pierce cloud cover and our sonar on various ships. So the liberators did in both Verdeman and Hartenstein.
Any other questions?
Yeah, were most of the U-boat, the heads of the U-boats as kind of almost fair to the survivors as these gentlemen were that you described? This
was the only time in all of World War II that they rescued survivors.
Okay.
I did not come across any other incident.
Mm-hmm.
And there was only one time when a German commander disobeyed orders to not kill survivors. The German policy was just leave them. And one German commander did strafe some survivors, but that was an isolated incident. But then when I studied Imperial Japan, it was common practice for them to kill survivors.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, Michael, I want to thank you for a really informative and entertaining lecture.
Very good.
Something I never knew about. Yeah, the Laconia. The shame.
Yeah, I figured it's hard to stump you, Richard. So
Not that hard.
it's
Trust
like
me.
this one story, I was like, oh, this is a good one. Nobody knows this.
Yeah. Now we do.
Yep,
Uh,
now we do.
I think Hollywood should get a hold of it and just give it the happy ending instead. The cooperation.
And that's probably why it will never be made into a movie, because they
I
do
think you're
like
right.
those upbeat endings.
There you go.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. It
It was
great
excellent.
talking to you all again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care now.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.